Welcome back to the Uber Cordero Show, in which we engage a lot of issues of international affairs that concern countries and people and societies, and we're bringing the education and the informed classroom discussion to the masses. And in today's video, we want to be sharing something I did at least a conference that I attended last week of African Studies Association, and I did present a paper on African Brazilian foreign policy on Africa, and I just wanted to uh, have it accessible to everybody who's watching the show, so they know what we're working on and what we are building up um, on research. And but the purpose of this lecture is to share with you what I presented on, um, so you are knowledgeable about it and you are more informed about the kind of discourse that we engage in the show. But I also wanted to remind our viewers that it'd be nice to support this program by subscribing and sharing, and that helps us keep engaged and attracts more people. So please share to your friends, subscribe, and keep watching. So thank you. So today's topic is the Brazilian foreign policy on Africa, and we discuss it from a perspective of whether it is a policy or it is an additional fad, um, which is I call the national interest, if there's such thing exists. Now, if we want to talk about, we're going to go back to the background and lay out some of the fundamental arguments that we make. One, which is the Brazilian foreign policy has evolved significantly over time, uh, from a focus on ideology to one that's based on pragmatism. So to unpack the forces that drive Brazilian foreign policy, you have to know the complex interplay of factors, including, among other things, national interest, historical ties, and cultural affinity. Um, and what is driving this policy is, uh, in my thinking, an aspirational transformation of the country to become a powerful actor in international affairs, especially in the developing world. So you want to stay with me to see how I make this case using other things. So in order to start this discussion, we have to explore the timeline of Brazilian foreign policy on Africa. And the first one goes way back before the 19th century. It kind of takes force in the 19th century. But as you know, Brazilian foreign policy uh, is factored around the transportation of Africans into the Americas. So it's kind of this episode of human trafficking and transportation of enslaved Africans into the Americas, into Brazil, which accounted for more slaves than Africans who were enslaved than any other space in America, either north or south. So before that, Brazil had always been in the nexus of Portugal, Africa, in the triangular trade, in which many Africans were transported into Brazil. To this day, 1 in 2 Brazilians have some kind of ancestry back to Africa. Some of them are blatantly open about it, and others are kind of dismissive of that fact. And some of the issues are a little beyond the scope of this presentation on why that exists, a denial of that. But in general, yeah, Brazil has perhaps the highest concentration of Afro-descended people in the Americas. So let's turn to the 19th century, in which Brazil's extractive trade with Africa through sugarcane plantation and enslavement is kind of enhanced, and the country is gravitating towards independence. And as it does, it establishes trade relations with Portuguese colony countries such as Sao Tome and Principe, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and many other, Cape Verde, and as well as many that were in the Lusosphere. Lusosphere here references to the Portuguese-speaking countries. In the 1960s, Brazil, so as in the era of decolonization in Africa, many of the African countries gained independence, and Brazil kind of positioned itself sort of like as an ally and also sometimes an ambivalent actor with regard to the foreign policy of Africa. So its foreign policy was driven by calculations on where its interest, a national interest, lied. So you have to remember in the 60s, Brazil was going through sort of like a reawakening in which military coups and military dictatorship was a significant actor in the politics of the country. And most of these coups were led by right-wing military leaders who were influenced by uh, extreme right-wing positions in party politics. So that was the national conscience. It's very Euro-centered in that regard. So Brazil performatively aligned itself with anti-colonial movements that supported the liberation of African countries. And this pivot has started happening in the 1980s. But in the 60s, Brazil was a little silent in terms of decolonization of Africa because it had to appease Portugal, which was a big trade actor, but also an ex-colonial power that still occupied colonies in Southern Africa. At the same time, towards the 80s, Brazil played a significant role in the creation of non-aligned movement as a subordinate actor in the non-alignment movement, which was uh, led mostly by India and China. Um, in the 90s, Brazil's foreign policy in Africa gravitated towards pragmatism in position of Brazil's pursuit of economic engagement and military cooperation with African militaries and African police to enact security and also to advantage Brazilian expertise as an opportunity for economic gains. So since the 2000s, the Brazil has kind of centered this South-to-South cooperation and solidarity narrative. It has continued to emphasize foreign affairs towards win-win situations and towards the creation of organizations such as the BRICS, which stands for the most consequential actors within the Southern caucus of countries that are emerging. And Brazil kind of is the first B in BRICS. So Brazil has played a crucial role in promoting also sustainable development and creating a pathway for countries to find foreign policies that may not necessarily be aligned with the US-led collusion that is dominant internationally. So now, because I'm an international relations scholar, we have some theoretical frameworks that we use to analyze. This is called the conceptual frameworks, and the first one, which is dominant, is called realism. So we want to think about Brazilian foreign policy to Africa with regards to how it plays out in the theories of international relations. So one of the central prepositions of the realism is that the international system is anarchic, which means there's no leader. All the states are equals and they're supposedly leaderless, and there is no police, and the international system at the state level is a man eat man society, sort of like a bad neighborhood in which in no country is safe, and therefore self-interest drives the actions of countries. And powerful countries dominate smaller actors in pursuit of their national interest, which is a collective and shared, and the premise is the survival. So the survival of the state in an environment of anarchy. So Brazil's foreign policy towards Africa can be analyzed through a realist lens by examining its efforts to extend its influence in the international arena in spaces where it's much more of a dominant actor outside orbits and circle in which there are other actors more dominant than Brazil, if that makes sense. Then we can also think about it through another theory that we call liberalism. In international affairs, when you think about liberalism, you think about interdependence, mutual gain, globalization, and there's a facet within the neoliberal theory called the neoliberals, who focus more on open market and financial liberalization. Here, Brazil's foreign policy reflects the liberal principles as evidenced by its support for multilateralism, its commitment to democracy and human rights, and its engagement with initiatives that are aimed at promoting global trade. Here, in other words, through the liberal angle, we think about Brazil's effort to increase its financial gains and promotion of its ideas uh, that are materially gainful for the country in Africa. Okay, so the last theory, which is related to another one I'm going to talk about, is constructivism. And within the constructivist framework, we see the foreign policy of Brazil as shaped by how it sees itself. So, in other words, identity matter. And constructivism says the national identity is constructed by elites and supposes what the society thinks is most important. And in this case, so one of the questions we ask, does the country have a national Black consciousness that is geared towards Africa? It might have a Black consciousness, which is just existing on its own, and it's not geared towards Africa. So here, when we think about Brazil, we analyze through a constructivist lens, examining how its national identity and historical experiences have influenced interaction with other countries. And in this case, it's Africa. Is there a cultural affinity? Is there for a desire for return? Is there some sort of collective consciousness that is shared between Brazil and the African countries? We want to ask that question. And within constructivists, there are constructivists who are post-colonial theorists. And here we think about on the one hand, Brazilian society is a post-colonial society crafted within structures of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So the fact that a lot of Brazilian history is focused on this episode of slavery and human trafficking and the dislocation and disempowerment of Black bodies is steeped around structures of supremacy in which whiteness allows one not to be slave. In some cases, even darker-skinned Brazilians could own as slaves, but most of the time, the idea of ownership is on which one group of people claimed ownership over others. So that's really centered on anti-Blackness, violence, and trafficking and dispossession. Okay. On the other hand, Brazil is a dominant actor that can also project and assert its power in an international system that bullies powerless actors such as many African countries. So on one hand, Brazil is a post-colonial society structured around supremacy of other people, mostly European descended people, and within European institutions. But on the other hand, Brazil also projects power because it sees an avenue in which it can leverage its supposed relative power to dominate other actors. So a post-colonial perspective of Brazilian policy challenges conventional perspectives that we have on countries that project the country as a neutral actor and a benevolent actor in the global arena. In other words, we want to think about Brazil as it sees itself, one that is a racial democracy and a colorblind society in which institutionalized segregation was never a thing. But in the absence of institutionalized segregation, here's what we're talking about is the idea like Jim Crow in the American South, or apartheid in South Africa, or some form of legalized segregation in many countries in the colonial era and after. Brazil never had that. But in the absence of that segregation, there is also the presence of discrimination and othering of people who did not fit a specific narrative. So the idea of a racial democracy is a myth. But lastly, this consciousness of Africa from a post-colonial perspective highlights the absence of knowledge about Africa. So from the anecdotes and stories of Brazil, Africans in Brazil, they are shocked at how much uneducated and unrelated on Africa many Brazilians are. They are just as ignorant and knowledge and lacking awareness of the continent's place in their lives and roles. And so that this distance has created a dislocation. So with the theories behind, let's think about the drivers of Brazilian foreign policy in Africa. And one of them is a conversation on national interest. And in Brazil, the national interest is kind of captured and redefined by the powerful actors within the society, which has historically been from a specific group. So as Brazil seeks influence in Africa and secure access to resources, mostly natural resources, you want to ask who is the driver, who benefits from this national interest, okay? National interest is often convoluted and is socially constructed to mean it's advantageous to the state, but in many cases, it refers to the interests of the big man. So the idea of objective national interest from a constructivist perspective is lacking because it's the big men. So we want to ask the question: who are the big men in in Brazil? So how does this manifest? It's through alliance of oil producers and national interests focused on appeasing Portugal and Western countries in the moments when you would think that the Brazilian interest will be reflective of like more than half of its population. So when we think about Brazilian engagement with Africa, we want to see how historically there has been a surge in interest and then a dwindling of the same, in which there are episodes where Brazilian interest has been reenacted, recreated on the perspective of allyship and friendship and historical affinity. But this has also disappeared as right-wing politicians take power and African places kind of ordered. But in general, even as that happened, the general consciousness is one in which is very one-directional. So what's the role of Brazil and historical ties to Africa? Well, one of them is that investment. Brazilian trade to Africa has skyrocketed, is accounting about $1 billion. It's still small compared to big actors in the continent like USA, China, France, Italy, India, and UK. So Brazil is kind of like lower there in terms of how much it's trading with the continent. But what is true is that Brazil offers an interesting opportunity for African countries, particularly with regards to how much it places. So one of the black visibility is through Brazilian soccer, and people like Pele and many early Brazilian players who were black were kind of seen in world football as kind of like the international presence on a globally visible sport in which many African people saw themselves on the screen for the first time starting from the 40s. So this is historically important. But absence of kinship, there is also a lack of kinship. So kinship, the idea of relatedness on phenotypical features does not mean it's like deeper relationship underneath that. And that's kind of what the Afro diasporic community in Africa is in Brazil is trying to communicate and to kind of pivot towards. So, well, there is opportunity, there is advancement in communication and increasing presence of African people as migrants in major cities like Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires. There's also still a lack of connection between the Brazilians and the African in ways that are more detailed and structured and reciprocal, other than extractive economic arrangement that facilitate power holders in Brazil. So at the end of this conversation, what we see is that Brazilian foreign policy is a complex and evolving. It's driven by complex interplay of interests, but is nonetheless still lacking in terms of sophistication and solidarity that is needed for a much more structured engagement. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this presentation has been informative to you. Please be sure to subscribe and share this presentation. Bye-bye.